Well, overall, if the budget passed as is, it would probably be a positive impact on counties. The main reason is the internet sales tax piece that's included in the budget is a pretty big revenue source for counties. It's the second largest revenue source overall, and for more than half the counties, it's the number one revenue source. So that's a pretty big component of the budget. There are some negatives in the budget from a financial perspective, but we need to do more analysis to figure out what those are. But some of the items, including cashless bail, election reform, there's going to be local county costs for that there's no money in the budget for it. So we need to evaluate that. But overall, it's probably a net positive.
Explain, if you would, for people that may haven't followed that closely, how the internet sales tax will work.
Yeah, it's pretty seamless as it is now. We all know today that people buy a lot of things over the internet. Most of the time when you buy something over the internet, you're paying sales tax because you're buying it from a known entity, a Sears or through Amazon, and they usually collect. But there's a lot of what they call third-party vendors that use the Amazon platform where no one's collecting sales tax, particularly on these transactions. The Supreme Court ruled this past summer, that it's now required, or states are authorized to collect the sales tax, and they overturned a prior decision. So it's a administrative function partly by the state, and they wanted to streamline the process to make it easier for small vendors. So the governor introduced legislation that would require the Amazons of the world to collect sales tax on behalf of the third-party vendors. So it would happen automatically. It would be seamless for the purchaser. And the idea in the governor's budget is to make it easy on small vendors where they don't have to deal with the headache.
Tell us a little bit about the property cap, a big issue facing counties.
Yeah, the governor's proposing to make the property tax cap permanent. It's a struggle for counties, it's for all municipalities and school districts to stay under the cap. A lot of years it's less than 2%, it's the lower of inflation, or 2%. We were a little concerned about making it permanent without more mandate relief. There was some mandate relief earlier in the process, but it's kind of come to a halt. This governor's been pretty good about funding new expenses with state dollars. Raise the Age is an example. There's $200 million in the budget. There's another $100 million in the budget for indigent defense services. These are expansions he called for, but he's funded them. The problem is historically, the funding doesn't last. As soon as the state budget gets in trouble, the funding falls away. And that's a problem for us when you have a tax cap and you have no other option when the state revenue runs out.
What would you like to see happen in this area?
Well, we'd like to see new legislation that would be no new unfunded mandates. It would basically freeze all mandated costs in place where they are today. So as long as they're not increasing, it's something we can manage going forward.
And how do mandated costs affect counties?
Well, we have to pay for it. We're required under law to fund it, regardless of whether the state provides funding support for their portion of the cost. We are required to pay for the service, regardless. The last quarter kind of got knocked down a little bit because of the federal shutdown and some other things that were going on in the marketplace. But going forward, everybody's expecting a downward adjustment in GDP, but no recession, and that's very positive, but definitely slower growth going forward. And you'll see over the long run, the red line there, the long-term GDP growth in the economy's just been a little bit over 2%. And then there's the periods in the most recent time from 2016, you can see the different periods of the expected growth. And you'll also see when you see a downturn in the GDP like that, you're probably seeing it in your sales tax receipts as well. There is a correlation there. This is one of the longest expansions we've had of the economy going back to 1850. And in, I believe, July 1st will be in the longest expansion ever since 1850. One of the problems, though, it's also been the weakest for job growth and just general GDP growth through that. But and there's no expected downturn. So people tend to forget it's been 9 years of growth in the economy. This is just a chart showing how long it is, and we're only 5 months short of the longest economic expansion. As I said, there's some of the reasons for the slowing growth. There's the global economy is weakening a bit. Some of the numbers coming out of Europe and China in particular, their growth is slow. I mean, China had 6% growth, and it's like awful for them, but anybody would be very happy with 6% growth in their economy. But for them, that's quite a drawback for them. There's some other issues. The financial markets have been very unstable the last couple months. A lot of gyrations going on there because of a lot of uncertainty in the future. Rising interest rates has a little bit of a dampening effect, and these are some of the reasons that they've noted for why they expect the slowdown. Consumer confidence as well. I'm not going to go through all of these, but consumer confidence is weakening a bit. It's at a very high level today, so even though it's dropping, it's still at a very high level. In January, there was a fall off from about 98 to about 90, and the equilibrium point for consumer confidence is a rating of about 76. So even being at 90, it's very positive outlook for consumers, but it's falling. So there's a lot of the mindset there. You know, are consumers comfortable to go out and spend? Are they going to shore up? Are they going to save more? Are they going to reduce debt? That's all. They're starting to think that now as this number drops. If we drop into the 80s, then there's going to be more concern next month, and we'll see what happens. The government shutdown, people are concerned about that. That's now over for a while. We'll see. Hopefully it's for a longer term. This is a graph of real consumption and the savings rate for a typical consumer. And as consumer confidence drops and the GDP drops, spending drops, which obviously is 2/3 of the economy is consumer spending. So these are all the things DOB is looking at as they do their projections for the year on revenues. So this is what we had, around 3% growth in 18. They're expecting about 2.4 in 19 and around 2% in 2020 and beyond. Obviously, this is all going to change in 6 months, but these are their estimates for now. So they're projecting out, the financial plan goes out to 2023, so they have to figure out what their revenue picture looks like, and they have to use some sort of a benchmark to determine that. So they're looking at this type of growth. And this is pretty in line with a lot of consensus forecasts of blue chip advisors about future economic growth. Another little drag is the stimulus from the federal tax cut is waning a bit. There's still some positives in 2019. The reductions in the rates is still putting a lot of cash in consumers' pockets in theory. And that you're seeing that consumer spending could increase by about $55 billion in 2019 as a result of the federal tax cut. But the rates are becoming normalized now. Consumers are used to it, and we're moving on. That initial drop last year people saw in January and February because federal withholding was reduced, created an extra boost to the economy, and that's probably why we hit the 3% mark. But that's waning now a little bit. So it's a little bit of a headwind, but we're still in a good place. Nationally, job growth is good, but then again, it's slowing. One of the problems we're having here is, unemployment's below 4%, and businesses are having a hard time finding people to fill the jobs they have open. So you can't hire people that aren't there. There are people coming back to the labor market, have left the labor market, but they just don't have the proper skill set to match up with what businesses need at this time. So that also, this impacts consumer confidence when they see hiring slowing. But when unemployment is so low, you can't expect 300,000 monthly increase in employment. So everything's going to tamp down. And there's the sidebar here that even though we've created 20 million jobs since 2010, it's still the slowest expansion that we've seen. Interestingly, the other slowest expansion for growth and jobs was 2002 to 2007, right after the 9/11 attacks and the recession we had in early 2000. This is probably more of a function of a fundamental shift in our economy than anything else. I mean, the internet really started to take off in the 1990s. You have people that can work from home. They're outside of the traditional labor force. Technology, artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, we're all on the cusp of these things happening, and that all impacts people getting jobs. I used to talk about John Toomey, some of you remember John, about how technology changed a typical flight for him. Whereas in the past you had to go to a travel agent, or you had to call the airline directly, or you had to get your ticket. If you had a rental car, you had to go see the rental agent, and now you can do all that without even talking to a person. All those jobs kind of disappeared in that process, and that's technology creates jobs, but it also destroys jobs. And that could be more of a function of why job growth is slow post-1990, post-2000. We'll see what happens. Inevitably, we'll have another recession, and we'll see how the expansion works on the next one. The state is forecasting slow but steady growth. The state job growth, the U.S. job growth is compared there. We tend to lag the national average in New York and have for decades, unfortunately. Still positive, but 1.1% job growth in New York in 2019 is what they're projecting, part of the foundation of the financial plan. The U.S. job growth is slowing a little bit, but not proportionally not as much as we're expecting in New York. And having worked at DOB, they tend to be pretty conservative in their revenue estimates, and they don't want to be too rosy when they're putting the financial plan together. So they could be a little bit conservative in these estimates here. In New York State, this is the expectation for 2019 in job creation. You're looking at 104,000 jobs to get to the 1.1. More important is where are the jobs being created. This has been the pattern the last several years, predominantly health and education, the fire sector, professional business services, and leisure and hospitality. But you've got over 60% of job growth in services, pretty much, not counting the business services piece. As they call it in upstate New York, it's eds and meds. That's where your job production is coming from. It's, again, job growth is statewide, it's one thing. New York City is really driving the train here. The Hudson Valley has had some pretty strong job growth. The rest of the state, it's been very, very inconsistent, and it has been for a while. This might be a little hard to see even in your packet, but this is just a graphic that shows the employment growth over the first half of 2018 by region. And obviously, it's much stronger downstate, New York City, Hudson Valley. Even Long Island has struggled a bit in the first part of 2018. The Mohawk Valley and Southern Tier having slower growth. And again, this is just a breakdown of the districts. You can see the numbers on the right there. Yes, you're right. That's pretty slow growth for the most part. In most of upstate New York. The box at the bottom, the statewide growth, 1.5%. That's strong growth downstate up to almost 2%, but most of upstate, you're at 0.6%. So in all this context of, the movement of the economy, we have to remember where New York State gets most of its revenue and why the financial plan looks the way it does. 65% of the total tax coming in the state's from income taxes. And a lot of this, as the comptroller mentioned yesterday, I think he said 18% of all PIT comes out of Wall Street. So with bonuses and just salaries and the jobs down there, if they struggle, the state financial plan struggles because the revenues just aren't there. Another interesting statistic, the top 1% of wage earners in New York State accounted for 44% of all New York State adjusted gross income and 80% of realized capital gains. The governor's talked about this, and you may have seen it. The budget director's talked about it. This links back to the federal tax changes last year when they changed the SALT deductions, the state and local tax deductions. It really makes New York more expensive from a taxing perspective. We're less competitive against other states, especially for the extremely wealthy who can move very easily. Some of you may have seen a penthouse just sold in New York City for $238 million. The most expensive home in America. It was actually purchased 2 years ago, but the building's now being finished. Super rich hedge fund guy. He'll probably spend very little time in that apartment. He's also got the most expensive house in Chicago and one of the most expensive homes in London. And he also has the highest price he paid for a house in Miami as well. I don't know what his state of residence is, but the uber wealthy are clearly very mobile, and that becomes problematic for the state because we have a highly progressive income tax code. And you can see just by the stats that are laid out in the financial plan, we're very, very reliant on the wealthy to pay a lot of the personal income tax, which is the foundation of the state's tax base. And these are just a couple of graphs that shows how important the Wall Street is to the economy of New York. The chart on the left shows the number of jobs, but then the amount of wages that they generate off of Wall Street. It's not a huge percentage of total jobs, but it's a huge percentage of total income. And the chart on the right is the expected bonuses that they're put in the financial plan this year. Interestingly, the red bar there is my rough estimation of what they were projecting last year in the financial plan when the budget came out for bonuses. So they're clearly seeing a dip, and obviously December was a disaster for Wall Street, but a lot of that's been recovered in January. So the up and down, and we'll see what happens with the bonuses. As the comptroller said, they get paid out mainly in the first quarter of this year, which is the final quarter of the state fiscal year. So there's a lot of concern in the financial plan, and we'll look at it later, about revenue really dropping off in December and January, and they're not exactly sure why, or they're not telling us why. They may know, but this is another interesting feature about, as important as Wall Street is for the state, something that's been happening in New York City is it's had a huge tech boom down there, and now with Amazon coming, which over the next decade could be another 25 to 40,000, what people would call very good paying jobs, even for New York City, very much tech related. The point of this graphic is historically Wall Street, the growth in Wall Street income and salaries has always been higher than just about every other sector. And actually since the recession, they're starting to lag behind most other business sectors in job growth. And I think part of that is other IT coming out of the city. And we've actually looked at some of this in sales tax data. For New York City, there's a part of the tech boom, some of this product they deliver and they make is taxable for sales tax purposes. And if you were to go back 10 years and look through the quarterly sales tax data for that type of industry, it doesn't even show up on the radar, like in the top 20 of products produced. You come to 2018, it's in the top 10. So they're producing a lot of digital goods out of the city, which is balancing out. So maybe can Wall Street weaken in the future and we're okay? Are we offsetting with another industry? The city is clearly diversifying its economy a bit, but we still live and die by Wall Street revenues. Housing starts, they expect to be relatively modest. They've kind of fallen off towards the end of the year here. But, not a great thing in the future, but they're not seeing a drop off. So housing obviously is a big part of economic growth in the state. So there's the other issue too. This is the same problem we had last year. There's always uncertainty in a financial plan. You never know what Washington's going to do. The shutdown hurt directly for federal workers in the state. The funding decisions they make down there, less money coming into the state, that all impacts the financial plan. They have to make adjustments. They have to estimate over the next 4 years what we expect in revenues. And as I said before, will these super wealthy start leaving the state because they could go to Florida where there's no income tax. Somebody making $500 million a year, paying 9% here, could increase their salary by, their take-home pay by $45 million by moving. Tiger Woods moved to Florida. He used to live in California, so when he was making $100 million a year in endorsements, he saved $10 million doing that. So there's that unknown challenge, and we're so top-heavy on the revenue side with personal income tax. You know, what's going to happen in the future? We just don't know. There's the two biggest things the governor did in the financial plan to fill the gap, and we'll show a chart in a minute, but very reliant on deriving new revenues. And the main new revenue is extending the millionaire's tax. It was set to sunset at the end of 2019, and he's extending it for 5 years in the financial plan. It generates an enormous amount of money, and we'll show that in a minute. The other thing that he's doing to, maintain balance in the financial plan is sticking to the state's, his self-imposed 2% spending limit. They get a little creative in how they hit their 2% target. They're not as creative this year as they have been in the past. They may be running out of ideas, I don't know. But there's still some prepaying expenses for 2020 in the current year, so it doesn't count against next year. Not taking state money out of the operating side of the budget, put it in the capital side, moving payments from the spending side to the tax expenditure side. All of that happened in the past. It's still going on, and it grows each year. Each one of those components grows to help them stay under their 2% limit. But there's spending cuts in there too. The Citizens Budget Commission, when they look at the budget presentation, they think actual growth in state spending is closer to 3.1% versus 1.9%. And that's their analysis when you look at all the prepaying of expenses and shifting costs around, taking things off budget. They're not doing as much of it this year because they did a lot of it the last couple of years. And this is just the big picture. The opening gap for 2020 is just a little over $3 billion. The next line there, where I circled it, the 1.5, the 1.6 billion there, that's the revenue reestimates they did in the financial plan within the last couple of months. So what happened is tax receipts in December were way lower than everybody thought, and they didn't bounce back in January. There's some speculation, and I'm sure they have a better understanding than I certainly do of why this is happening. But there's a lot of tax maneuvering at the end of the calendar year for people to be ready, and they want to lower their federal and state tax liability. With the federal tax changes, the end of the year might not be that important anymore in New York, because certain things you just can't make those adjustments anymore to benefit yourself. So they're thinking maybe that's part of the reason the revenue dropped. But there's definitely a concern. So in the current year, they lowered revenue estimates for the final quarter, last half of the year by, I think, about $400 million. But when they lower it for the current year, they have to lower it for all the out years. So the gap starts at 3 for 2020, but because of the readjustment and the revenue drop-off, they had to drop it by another $1.6 billion for 2020 fiscal year, which starts April 1st, 2019. But then you look at the out years, that one adjustment triggers all those other adjustments, and then that's the gap they really have to fill at the end of the day. As I said here, the chart goes through some of the spending changes. There's a lot of spending changes in the first year, not as much in the other out years. And then the gap is at the revenue actions, and this, the revenue actions third from the bottom there, and you'll see how big those get out in the out years. The revenue actions he's putting in this budget, it's 1.2 billion this, 1.3 billion this year, grows to 4.4, 5.7, 6.3. Almost all of that is the extension of the millionaire's tax. That's how much money is coming in from that tax. And that tax is for incomes over $1 million. I don't know the exact number. I think it is adjusted for inflation. But instead of paying 6.8% or 6.6, they're going to pay 8.8, somewhere in that ballpark. So it is a big difference for those in that bracket, but they never really paid the 6.6. It was set to sunset, so for them it's sort of a wash. It's one way to look at it.
If it was my money, I don't know. I might look at it differently. But we do have out-year gaps, and at the very bottom there, it says adherence to the 2% spending cap. And you can see how much money that generates if they manage to stay within their self-imposed 2% spending cap. But even doing, I mean, we still have a gap in 2021 if they do adhere to the cap. Pretty sizable gap. In the out years, you're looking at surpluses there, so it might be a little bit easier. But this is all a projection today, and next year they're going to redo the financial plan, and these numbers are all going to change. But they have to build and they have to make their assumptions. This chart's too small for anybody to see, but it just kind of highlights some of the big changes in spending and in revenues to make the financial plan work. Again, here's a little breakdown of the revenue raisers, the extension of the millionaire's tax. You can see in the out year there, it's $5.5 billion in 2023. And there's a couple of things here that also benefit us, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but the ESCO tax change, there's a sales tax exemption on energy service companies that the governor's proposing to eliminate. There's the adhering to the Wayfair decision by the Supreme Court to actually collect sales tax on the internet. The governor's taking a two-pronged approach to that. It generates revenues. There's some fee issues in here. The medical marijuana is in here. The Cannabis Regulation and Taxation Act. Actually, the Citizens Budget Commission praised the governor for his approach to medical marijuana revenue, that he's very, very conservative. And he doesn't count on anything until 2021. So the expectation is no shops will be open. Like the woman from Massachusetts said, it took them 2 years to get their first retail store open. Probably looking at a similar process here. And the first retail outlets will probably be medical marijuana dispensaries today. They'll just open a back door, not a back door, but you know, they'll have another door for adult use. So there's a couple of things the governor does. As I said, that the budget division does try to be responsible with the money they have, given the people in charge and what they tell them to do. So they try to create, if things go bad, they want to create safe harbors where they can control spending better. So this governor's had this authority in the budget for the last couple of years. I think this will be the third year. But if there's a reduction in Medicaid funds or any type of federal funding of more than $850 million within the time frame of the fiscal year, the director of the budget would be able to cut funding, mainly local assistance, across the board. And then the legislature would have 90 days to approve it. We haven't hit this threshold yet on the federal side. This was a bigger scare during the Affordable Care Act, and had that been repealed, the state would have lost about $3 billion in federal money. The counties would have lost the $600 or $700 million benefit we get now, which is kind of split between New York City and the counties. That all would have evaporated. With the current makeup of Congress, I'm not sure the ACA is going to get repealed, but it's going through the courts now, so there's that issue there. The governor asked for this second provision. If revenue estimates fall by more than $500 million in the year, he's asking for authority to cut across the board in local assistance 3% from all programs. But he would exempt education, Medicaid, and I think public assistance. So the 3% that's left is, I mean, as a county, Medicaid is, we pay our set amount as we're told to. Public assistance would be exempt. That would have hurt us. And education, which is a lion's share of spending. But everything else you get as a county, like a state reimbursement, would be cut. He asked for this last year. The legislature didn't give it to him. The real threat here is, and we just talked about it, they've been off on the revenue estimates by $4.6 billion over the last going on 4 years now, and they've changed their revenue estimates 7 times in that period. So a $500 million negative adjustment is, there's probably a pretty good chance that could happen again based on the recent historical trend of the revenue estimating. That's something you can't budget for either. It's a mid-year cut before they realize. It's usually halfway through the financial plan, which is September. which is 9 months into your fiscal year, it's very difficult to manage a 3% across the board and, dozens of programs potentially. As I indicated before, there's some good things in the budget. We talked about this last year. The governor is on round 3 of offering this up in the budget. We've had mixed support in the legislature. The Senate has never really supported this concept. But basically, it's with the Supreme Court decision, it's pretty clear states have the right to collect sales tax on internet transactions when people sell stuff into your state. So, as I said before, the governor's taking a two-pronged approach here. He's proposing legislation to make it easier for small vendors to have their sales tax collected by somebody else, which means if you sell stuff using Amazon or Etsy or eBay as your platform, eBay, Etsy, and Amazon will be responsible for collecting all the sales tax and remitting it directly back to the state. That requires a legislative change, because you're basically saying, and this is done under retail products for brick and mortar today in New York. If you go, I always give the example of the antique mall. You go to an antique mall, there's 100 different vendors in there, there's one cash register. The cash register is responsible for collecting sales tax for everybody. The state is viewing Amazon and these marketplace providers as the cash register, and they will be responsible for collecting sales tax. The benefit for small vendors is if they have an agreement with Amazon to do that on their behalf, they have no responsibility to collect sales tax, and they don't have to do anything with the state other than show, I've got my certification, they send it in once a year. I don't know how easy that administrative process will be, but the intent is Amazon's driving the bus here, and some of these online retailers, let them do it. The other half is there's an administrative piece, and I'll go through it here. But these are just a few slides on how big digital commerce has become. It's just growing leaps and bounds. It's really amazing through the years. And Amazon is an animal. Half of everything sold over the internet goes through Amazon. It's either their own product they sell directly, or it's that big blue blob there, the 31% of what they call the Amazon marketplace. 31% of everything sold over the internet is Amazon's marketplace. And that's where sales tax collections tend not to get collected, is the third-party vendors. And that's growing. The marketplace is growing faster than Amazon's own sales. But Amazon doesn't mind, because they get a fee from everything sold on their marketplace. And when they start collecting sales tax, they'll charge a fee for that too, I'm sure. And everybody else, the rest, is the other half. And so, and this is some of the statistics, just looking at the dollar amounts and eBay's the next closest, and they're 12 times smaller or 10 times smaller. It's just amazing how big. And Amazon's growing at double digits each year. Obviously, you can't do that forever. There's going to be a point where it levels out. And what do the guys sell? This is just some information. This is why you're seeing locally your big box electronics retailers having a hard time. They're not opening new stores, and they're having a hard time staying in business because the competition online, the number one competitor is electronics, and then it's clothing. It's affecting your department stores, your independent clothing store. They just have a hard time competing, and that's mainly where they're competing online, especially in the third-party category. The key points we make on this always on the sales tax is this is not a new tax. This tax is owed under state law, and for many counties, sales tax is your number one source of revenue. It's far outstripped your ability to than property taxes. We share a lot of sales tax. We're going to share close to $2 billion in 2018 of sales tax with towns, cities, and villages. Cities have the right to preempt. And it's, we use the sales tax to help offset increases in property tax. And as I said, the marketplace is a statutory component where he's going to have Amazon collect. That proposal on a full annual basis, the division of budget is assuming that's worth about $280 million for counties in New York City. And it's almost an even split between the counties in New York City as far as, what share are you of the e-commerce marketplace. And the state gets a benefit too of about $250 million from this proposal, the legislative side of it. The other one is the administrative piece that I mentioned before, and this is really the state enforcing its existing tax law going back to the early 1990s when the initial Supreme Court decision was made, and it was all regarding nexus, and I'm not going to bore everybody with what nexus is because I don't fully understand it, big legal term. But the state set up their own model for nexus back then in the early 90s, and there were certain thresholds they built into state law. When the Quill decision was overturned this past summer, the state just popped up existing law, and they're telling anybody who's a remote seller and you sell product into New York, if you are over this threshold, you are responsible to collect sales tax and file with us as a vendor, sales tax vendor. And the state law in New York is $300,000 in annual sales and 100 transactions. The Supreme Court gave guidance to all the states to say you should be collecting sales tax if it's over 200,000 or 200 transactions, not and, but or. So the moat we've provided small vendors in New York is more generous than what the Supreme Court called for. But this administrative thing would bring in, it's estimated 110 million annually on a full annual basis to the counties. That's effective immediately. So we'll see how the numbers work out, over the next 6 to 9 months if we see a little bump. The grand scheme, though, 390 million is a big number, but in local sales tax, we're collecting, I think, close to 17 billion on an annual basis. So we're looking at around 2%. So even if we collected everything possible out there, we're looking at a 2% bump potentially for counties if everybody complies right away. And that's before you do your sales tax sharing. So I'm just trying to put it in perspective for counties. It's a big number, but as a share of your overall sales tax, it's a small percentage, but it's big in the context of a property tax cap. It's much larger than the annual growth in the tax cap for most counties. The second big item is the ESCO sales tax repeal. The governor offered this last year. It did not get through. There was objections in the Senate. The Assembly did support this last year. The Assembly did support the Internet Marketplace proposal. The Senate minority supported both of those when they were the Senate minority. Unclear where they're going to be as the Senate majority on both of these proposals. But this also has a benefit to the counties of about $48 million. New York City repealed this exemption years ago for the energy service companies within New York City. So this proposal has no impact on them, but it would benefit counties. And then as the rest of the presentation goes through the individual agencies and some of the things they did in the budget. I'm not going to go through all the details here on aging, but there's a net fiscal benefit by DOB's estimate of $11 million for aging programs. The idea here is to get more money for what I would call social determinants for aging. It's not necessarily direct health care, but it's making sure people are in their home being served, which can prevent additional medical costs in the future. And the state is actually taking a Medicaid savings on their side of the ledger by putting more money into the aging programs on this side. But it's positive. Our offices for aging in each county have been need more resources. This is a big one, especially for town supervisors of villages. The governor proposing to cut $60 million out of AIM. AIM hasn't increased 8 or 9 years. It's been set at $715 for quite a while. The philosophy they're using here is if it's less than 2% of your total expenditures, you're not getting your AIM anymore. And when you do go through the list, we have, I'm going to get my numbers wrong. We got 900 towns, a ballpark, 500 plus villages. The bulk of AIM money goes to the big 5 cities. And for those 5 cities, it can be 20 to 25% of all the revenue they collect is through AIM. So it's really targeted towards the big cities. for some of the smaller entities, and I'm not justifying what the governor's doing at all here, but when they look at it, some of these villages or towns are getting checks for a few $1,000s. Not that that's not important, but this is just the logic going through the governor's head. There's other issues around this too. There's speculation that this is going to was inserted as a bargaining chip to make the property tax cap permanent, which is going to force pressure at the end. I am speculating on that, but this is really an odd direction to go all of a sudden. Agriculture, this is not unusual. There's a little bit of a cut in funding for some of the local ag programs, but a lot of those are added back in by the legislature. So the governor usually only puts in his base funding. He actually put in more base funding than usual this year. The thing here, though, is last year these ads from ag almost always came out of the Senate. It was a Senate ad back. So we have a new Senate. We'll see how we fare in this area. Community college funding, it's less aid. It's about $12 million. You should talk with your community college presidents because I'm sure it translates to a lot more than, a fraction of a percent. Because they basically flatline the state aid FTE, but if your census is going up or down in students, that could be a much bigger impact on your campus than what it looks like here. The governor is saying, well, I'm just level funding the program, but it's less money in the system. And they're saying it's because there's less students in the system, which is true because the economy is doing well. It's easy to get a job. People aren't retraining. But it ends up being a big cut for your campus, which then again impacts chargebacks if you don't have a campus. So whenever they take money out of the system, it directly falls into the county's lap. That's just a breakdown of where the money is coming from. He's added a couple of new things here. The Family Empowerment Pilot is basically on-campus childcare for single adults who have children. And this is our history of state FTE support. We haven't grown that much. In 2008-9, we were at about 2,700, and now we're at about 2,800. Over a 10-year period with inflation, clearly we're not keeping up. And we did drop in some intervening years during the Great Recession. There's a lot of criminal justice reform in this budget. It's a continuation of things they've done in the past. The big one this year is the elimination of cash bail or bail reform. We will look at this more closely, but there's no additional money in the budget to deal with the ramifications of this. So the idea is basically to get people out of jails, let them stay in the community, so you won't have people sitting in your jails pre-sentencing. And the statistics we've seen from the department, this is going to be different for every county, but statewide, typically in a county, 60% of your jail population is pre-sentenced, sitting there. That will vary by county. Some counties it might not be a big deal. Other counties it might be an even bigger deal. New York City, our understanding is close to 80% is pre-sentencing sitting in the Rikers. So that moves a lot of people out of the system that have to be monitored somehow. And it's going to fall on probation to do that through electronic monitoring of some sort or some other purpose. There's no additional aid. Now, the state's going to argue, well, you don't have all that per diem costs in your jail anymore, even though you have a contract and the State Commission on Corrections says you have to have certain staffing levels. When you add this all up, because the legalization of marijuana potentially is no longer a criminal offense, potentially, if it passes. You have raised the age changes, and we're seeing the arrest rate drop dramatically in that age cohort. And then you add in bail reform, it's definitely going to have an impact on your local corrections facilities. It's something we have to look at. And there's several other things here that'll impact on the DAs, but we're still working through the details in the budget. But a lot of changes here. And some of the stuff is actually beneficial about investing some more money in reentry programs. The governor also wants to apply for a federal waiver in Medicaid to allow, the waiver would ask that we could start providing Medicaid to incarcerated individual 30 days prior to release. So you could set them up on their regimen, make it sort of set up, and it would continue automatically when they get released from the jail. That does require a federal waiver. No state has received one yet, but they want to submit this waiver, and we'll see if it goes. The president, I think, is a little, I'm not sure where he'll go on this. This is something that he might actually support. He's very populist on some of his criminal justice ideas, and in December they passed a big bill that couldn't get passed under the prior president and it released a lot of prisoners out of this federal system early. Will have that impact at the end of the day. So this is something they might be open to, and he's actually mentioned reentry programs. The idea is to reduce recidivism over the long run. A lot of times people are released, they go off their meds, or there's some other issue, they're not connected to medical care, and they get in a bad situation, and they fall back into old patterns. So there are some positive things in the budget that could help offset some of these potential costs, which we can't calculate at this time. Excuse me. There's a small rate increase for the early intervention program. It's 5%. For those of you that are unaware, we pay 100% of the freight on the increase, and then we can file for reimbursement about a year from now. New York City might take 18 months to file for reimbursement. I don't know. They just have a bigger system we do. But in a way, it's a very good thing. We've had a very hard time in recent years attracting providers into this system. The problem is we really kind of wanted the state to pay for it, the full freight on the increase, but it's in there. It's not a huge amount. DOB estimates $500,000 an additional cost for New York City and $300,000 for all the counties combined. And I'm not sure 5% is going to be enough to drag people in. I don't know. No. New York City people are telling me no, it's not going to be enough. Then the governor reauthorized his economic development program, round 4 of the downtown revitalization initiative at $100 million. He's continuing his workforce development program. He wants to build a life sciences lab at Albany for $750 million. That's been on the table for years, although it's grown from $300 million to now $750. So they're clearly expanding what they want to do there. There's money for ORDA, a new health science center in Binghamton, continuing the Clarkson Trudeau partnership in the North Country, and more money for Buffalo. When I saw East Side Corridor, I'm thinking New York City. I'm like, $50 million, that won't get you 10 feet down there. But clearly it's a different project, different East Side Corridor. Election reforms, this is now law.